Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. I'm General Manager of New West Press, and Matt Bowes, and we're a independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And with me today is Frances Peck, author of the new book, Uncontrolled Flight. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well, Matt. Thank you. Pretty excited to be here. Launch date is, or official publication date is just days away now on Friday.
Yeah. So this is your second book with us. Your first one was The Broken Places, which got great reviews all over the place, sold a bunch of copies, everyone liked it. What's it like following up a popular book? I'll get right into it. Bam.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you're getting right into the psychology of it too. I was emailing somebody this morning, actually an early reader, somebody that I know in Ontario ordered the book as a pre-order, and she got it and read it just in a couple of sittings, and thankfully she wrote me to say that she really loved it and she couldn't put it down. And she
Good.
said she was a big fan of The Broken Places, and she said going into this book she was a little worried that she wasn't going to like it as much because she thought it's not fair. I like The Broken Places so much, I
Hmm.
just can't expect the same from this book. But happily, she went on to say that she liked this one just as much, and went on to say why. And I wrote her back and I told her, this could not be better timing, because these last few weeks I've been going around in a very peculiar state of suspension. And in my email to
Mhm.
her, I said it was like feeling like a bit of meat inside aspic or something. I feel like I'm kind of hanging here, suspended, waiting, because once you've got a book out there, like once it's published, it's between covers, it's going to be on the shelves and available to purchase. Your control over it and anything you can do with it is really done. So now
Yep.
it's all up to readers, and I do find that a fascinating position to be in and a terrifying one, I have to say. So I'm in kind of a strange state at the moment. If other readers are like her and they pick it up and like it, then I'm going to feel a lot easier.
Yeah, I think people who've never published a book or don't work in the publishing industry don't realize just how long it takes to make a book. It's probably what, 2 years since this was accepted. We're a small press, so we have a fairly long lead time. We can only publish so many books a year, but I'm sure it kind of feels like you're in limbo. A lot of it, you're waiting to hear back from your editor on the manuscript, and then, yeah, it seems like a pretty protracted process from the outside. But once the end user, the reader, gets the book, it's all worth it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is. And it is so true about it being protracted. And when you throw the time that it takes to write the book into the
Hmm.
equation as well, in the case of Uncontrolled Flight, this new book, I actually wrote the first draft of it in what felt to me like a fairly quick period of time. I was having this sort of middle-aged crisis, I guess, midlife crisis, for lack of a better term. I had been, as you know, working as a freelance writer and editor for so many years on other people's words. And it was just eating away at me that I had to try my hand at writing something of my own. I hadn't done any creative writing since I hit my early 20s. I just put it all away, and I thought, no, I've got to give it a go again. And I gave myself 1 year to draft a novel. I thought, I'm going to step back a bit from work. I'm just going to work part time. I sat down with my husband. We made a budget. We figured out how we could make it work. So I had a hard deadline set for myself, and it was a financial deadline too. I had to get it done in a
That's
year.
good. I
And
wish more
yeah,
authors would actually set a deadline because I found that, and spoiler alert, this is actually the first book you written, but The Broken Places was the second, but published first. But I found that a lot of times people take forever on their first book and they want to make it perfect and tinker with everything. But then the second one shows up and they're like, oh no, I need to get this done a lot faster and I can't take my entire life building up to it. So it's good that you were able to kind of like hunker down and say, like, look, I only have so much time to write this.
well, yeah, and I'd say, if you're going to use this as a lesson for other writers, there's nothing like having a financial incentive behind it, because we
Mm-hmm.
simply couldn't afford for me to be working part time for more than a year. We weren't going to make our mortgage payments if it went any longer than that. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it was good. But I did write the manuscript for Uncontrolled Flight, the first draft of it, within a year. And then I did take up time, of course, to revise it, probably about another half a year or something like that, going through, giving it to a few people to read, taking their suggestions and polishing it before, it getting sent out with an agent, but to rejections at the time. The time was not right for this book, and it didn't get picked up, and that's why it's coming out as a second book. Like I basically
Hmm.
put it away in the drawer, and then you were kind enough to acquire The Broken Places, and then a little later on asked to see Uncontrolled Flight, and so here we are.
So do you find it odd, like you write Uncontrolled Flight first, and then you write Broken Places? Do you find it odd having gone through the whole process of publishing the book after the writing of the book and then starting again with your first book? Like, did you learn lessons along the way with Broken Places that you're able to apply to Uncontrolled Flight? Like, take me through that process a little bit.
I did learn some lessons. I definitely did. Um, and interestingly, it's interesting, I guess, because as a, my profession has been to be an editor as well as a freelance writer. I'd say most of the lessons I learned were editorial.
Hmm.
Having worked with Leslie, our editor, of course, at New West Press, I learned a great deal from her. And one of the things that she gently kind of encouraged me to do, I guess, with The Broken Places through her comments and so on, was to cut back a little bit here and there. She identified a few places that were, as she called it, baggy. That was the term that she used. Uh, and anybody who's listening who likes that term, I think Leslie Vermeer has said it's okay to use that term. She doesn't have it copyrighted or anything, but so I had a good hard look in The Broken Places at anything that was a bit baggy, that went on a bit too long, or was, overly protracted or repetitive for no good reason, and pared back. And I did that even more with Uncontrolled Flight. I was just more conscious of maybe places where I had overwritten or belabored a point. And so I hope, anyway, I feel like, and I hope that this is the case, that Uncontrolled Flight is even a tighter book.
Hmm.
And given that it is a fairly fast-paced book, you want that tightness, of course, to move the story forward.
Yeah, I guess I should say what the book's about. Hey, so this is a kind of viewed through a few different lenses, the investigation of a aircraft crash where Rafe Mackey is a firefighting pilot working in the interior. Sadly, very relevant this year, or especially Alberta this year. We've had so many fires, so this is relevant in that sense. But his plane goes down, and kind of the moments leading up to the plane crash, his entire life, his relationships with women, his relationships with men, like these are all different lenses by which you look at this guy's life. And uh, we were talking a bit earlier. You never actually hear from him; he's dead. But you're finding out how everyone else thought about him. And this is interesting considering. I would say that your last book was all about people's reactions to a natural disaster, where this is people's reactions to a personal small disaster. So why do you hate your characters so much?
Oh, I love my characters. Come on, Matt. I love
I know,
them.
I know. I'm just kidding, but you really put them through the ringer.
Yeah, but you know what? You know what I don't love? I don't love in real life, and I don't love when I'm reading as a reader. I don't love Pollyannas. I don't love people or characters who are just shiny and good, and they do everything right, and you know what I mean, like the that
Yeah.
that sort of person, it doesn't interest me. I mean, all
Yeah.
credit to them, that's great. I guess they have their lives together so well,
In real
that
life, sure, they seem great to hang out with, but in fiction,
maybe.
you want them to do things badly or do bad things because that makes it
Exactly.
exciting.
But
Yeah.
in real life too, I mean, I find those are the most interesting real humans, the ones who are flawed and the ones who are a little bit weird, or I don't know,
Yeah.
prickly or something like that. And no, and also I continue to be interested in what happens to humans, and therefore characters in my book, when their lives change on a dime.
Yeah.
That's one thing the two books have in common. In The Broken Places, an earthquake happens, and all of a sudden, normal life is completely upended. So, what does that do to the characters in the book, to their
Yeah.
perceptions of themselves and their relationships? And it's much the same in Uncontrolled Flight, except the precipitating event is this airplane crash. Rafe Mackey dies at the beginning of the book. How does that overturn the lives of the people that he was closest to, and who play a role in the death and the investigation of the death, of course, because one of the characters is an accident investigator who
Hmm.
is kind of involved in the incident and so on. So I find that interesting, like just what happens to us when something catastrophic occurs. And we all had an interesting real life experiment, of course, going through that with the pandemic, really,
Yeah.
which came on us so quickly as it did and out of nowhere, practically. And
Hmm.
we had to deal with it. And it taught many of us a lot about ourselves, but it didn't go well for a lot of us. I think a lot of us came out of the pandemic not feeling that we had aced it necessarily. And
That's an understatement. Yes.
well, there you go. And I think it's a bit the same in my books. Like the characters don't ace catastrophe. Like they're doing what humans do. They're stumbling and they're making stupid mistakes and they sabotage themselves and they're
Hmm.
angry with themselves and with others and they want to blame and they want to lash out, and all
Yeah.
those things are to me profoundly human and real and true.
Hmm. I like the time frame for this book. The Broken Places, as I recall, is mostly real time, like the hours leading up to the disaster, and then the hours afterwards, maybe a couple days. Plus, there's a bit of a future segment where an artist is uh, kind of remembering what happened during that time and kind of refiguring it into art. Whereas this, you have kind of everyone's different recollections of Rafe. You know, you find out what he was like as a kid all the way up till modern day. You have his partner Will, who's a kind of the spotter pilot, I guess. You see him all the way up until maybe what, a year and a half afterwards, and then you have the investigator Natalie immediately afterwards, sifting through the wreckage, such as it was. I think I appreciated that, like you were saying about the pandemic, people have different ways of interacting with disaster. And I felt like even as the pandemic was happening, I was like, yep, this is another boring day. I'm not leaving my house. But eventually it's all going to kind of meld together. It's going to be one long bad thing that happened, but the individual day to day thing's not going to matter. And I think your book does replicate the way that you look at disaster and tragedy, just time wise. Was that intentional? Just like kind of trying to show people's processing of grief in different ways and the different time fields that you were working in?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it was intentional because you're right. The timelines of Will, the pilot who sees Rafe crash, and the accident investigator, Natalie, those are quite immediate, right after the crash. And so the things that are going on with them are kind of fast-paced and a bit knee-jerk and precipitated by the immediate emotional aftermath of the crash. Sharon, the widow of Rafe, her timeline is in the future. It's
Yeah,
months after the crash. And I did that deliberately because I wanted us to meet her and start getting her thoughts after she's had time to get through that initial period of loss. And now she's left with that grinding reality of waking up every morning, having a second where you don't remember all that's happened and then you
yeah,
remember, and then that grief just comes crashing over you, a giant wave that it is. And so she is at a very different state. She's in a sort of longer term grief, and then the timelines end up kind of marching toward one another in a sense, in that Will and Natalie end up kind of coming into Sharon's time frame. But no, I did think about that because I find it interesting thinking about tragedy and grief, how we do react very differently at different stages of it. I know so many stories, and I, there are some that I've been part of where a person has lost a loved one, and in the immediate aftermath of it, things are just kind of psycho, and
Hmm.
sometimes things get said and done that people profoundly regret later, and you think, why did that happen? There is an almost a kind of a psychosis. I probably shouldn't use that word because I don't want to minimalize or trivialize that word or misrepresent it, but there is a kind of a strange state that you get into in the immediate aftermath of a death, when it's a sudden death, of a
Yeah.
loved one, where, yeah, all rational thought is gone, uh, expected reactions are gone, and you can say and do things that are shocking and that you deeply regret later. And it seems to just be part of the process. So that's a very interesting state. And then the state that happens much later after you've been living with the grief for a while, that's different. Yeah, it's almost more elegiac at that point, and the rhythm is
Yeah.
different. It's a little more flowing, a
Well, you
little
can't
less
do anything
frenetic.
anymore. It's just, you're just, you can either wallow in it all the time or move on, and you kind of have to move on at some point.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Just makes me think of the pandemic again. I don't even think we've gotten to that state where we're actually over the grief or even acknowledging it. I mean, I thought there would be a monument or something we would build. Like, everyone just wants to sweep that under the rug. So that's kind of the governmental approach, is that, oh, it was very sad, but now we're all going back to work. And I think that
Yeah.
is kind of interesting with regards to Natalie's character, because it is her job to investigate um, plane crashes and horrible events like that. And you have to kind of develop a thick skin. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do your job. And I know you have somewhat personal experience of someone like this. So is it, when it is your job to encounter tragedy all day long, what's the best way to deal with it that you've seen?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think that experts in the matter, and I'm not one of them, are still trying to figure that out. Um, but talking about it, that might sound kind of evident to you, me, I mean, anybody, I guess, who's comfortable talking about such things. There are a lot of people who are in these fields who are not comfortable talking about what they experience every day.
Yeah.
But my husband, who is a retired air accident investigator, is a talker. And indeed, he was certainly one of the fonts of research behind the book, because I heard lots and lots about cases that he worked on, including some of the very gory details, which he
Hmm.
only told me because he knew I was okay with it. I mean, he asked me at the beginning of our relationship, was I all right with it? And indeed, I was. I mean, my dad was an RCMP officer, and I only heard details of things that he dealt with very late in his life,
Hmm.
near his death. In fact, that was the only time he felt comfortable talking about things that he'd seen, horrific things. And I think that my father's response is still pretty typical in a lot of those fields, namely that you
Yeah.
don't talk about it, you bottle it up, although you can talk about it to, in a strange way, in a way we might not expect, with your colleagues. So, in
Hmm.
the world of police, paramedics, um, accident investigators, other, firefighters, other first line responders, there's this really interesting culture of Black humor. And if you
Yeah.
live with one of them, you experience this. And so they'll make these really rude and tasteless jokes about things like death and bodies and dismemberment and just all the horrible things that they have to see, and they share that with one another. And again, just
Hmm.
because I've had a few people in my life who come from those backgrounds, I've been privy to the kind of Black humor that goes on, and they're well aware they can't share that with other people because it just
Yeah.
sounds insensitive or tasteless, but it is their way, I think, of normalizing what happens to them, of sharing
Yeah.
it, but doing it in a way that interestingly doesn't make them vulnerable. Like, they're not talking about
Hmm.
it in an open-hearted way with one another. They're joking about it. And that allows them to deal with it and move on without really opening the package, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It seems like a pretty macho field, kind of like soldiers with post-traumatic stress. Like, they didn't even have that term until the Vietnam War. Before, it was just like shell shock. You had to think of cool ways to say it, but it's people who've had their personalities rearranged by dealing with their own mortality on a daily basis. So it makes sense that you'd want to vent that in different ways, and humor is as good as any.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I really wanted to explore with Uncontrolled Flight was how Will, the 36-year-old male, single male firefighting pilot, deals with having seen his best friend and his mentor crash and die right before his very eyes. How does he handle that? And
Mm-hmm.
he handles it, especially at the beginning, much the way that a lot of men, especially from that world, might tend to do. And that is, he doesn't want to bare his soul. He doesn't come from that kind of background. He's not comfortable with it. He just wants to hole up in his apartment, not really talk to anybody, including the counselor that he's forced to go to. And he just
Yeah.
sits there silent with her session after session. And he just wants to go about his business. He just wants people to leave him alone and let him get by with it. But we know that that's not a healthy way to process trauma. I
Yeah.
went to a talk years ago. I was at a conference that was being put on by the Communications, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, which is a pretty male-dominated union. I was there to give a workshop on plain language. And I went to the opening keynote speech of that conference, and it was being given by a fellow named Michael Landsberg. And Michael Landsberg is a Canadian journalist, especially sports journalist. So he's done all kinds of commentary on hockey and whatnot. And I had no idea, I'll be honest, who the heck he was when I went there, but everybody in the union knew who he was, and
Mm-hmm.
big hockey guy, I guess. Anyway, he's become a spokesperson about mental health. He lives with depression, crippling depression. And that was the subject of the keynote speech that he was giving, because the theme of this conference was mental health. And he knew he was speaking to a male dominated union. And he said over and over through his talk, I am not weak. I
Mm-hmm.
am sick. I am not weak. I am sick. And he said for men in particular, that's a huge distinction to make, that so many men feel that if they admit to depression, sadness, overwhelming despair, that they're weak, and it undermines everything that they present about themselves to the people around them and in their jobs. But if they think that it's a sickness, that they're suffering the symptoms of a sickness, that repositions the whole thing.
Yeah,
And
it's
that, I
something
have
being
to say,
imposed on you rather than something inherent in yourself.
exactly that. And to think of it as a sickness, well, then it's something that I can treat and I can deal
Mm-hmm.
with, and
You can
it's
hopefully
okay. And
cure it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that talk stayed with me for so long. It definitely was a motivator for this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some very interesting psychological profiles that play in this book. And again, that time frame thing we were talking about is a way to kind of stretch it out and kind of not show all the months and weeks of wallowing and stuff. Like you get to see these people at various points in their grieving process. And I think it's fantastic. So you have a little taste of the book for our listeners. Why don't you set that up?
Sure, I'm going to read from chapter 1 of the book. And this point of view that we're going to hear from is that of Will. He's the I, the first person in this piece. So, Will, again, as a reminder, 36-year-old firefighting pilot from Vancouver. In the prologue earlier in the book, he's just seen his mentor crash. He's been up in the air in a plane. Will has been with Ernie, who is an air attack officer, flying with him, and together they see this other plane go down, which contains Rafe. And Will, at this point, is in the middle of some enforced time off work. They always say how important it is to see someone at a time like this. By someone, they mean a professional, a stranger who knows nothing about you, but is going to forage around in your deepest thoughts anyway and root out the ones that don't belong and leave you refreshed and fixed and empty. What do I know? To me, during that first long week after the crash, the most therapeutic course of action was to hunker down, sleep a lot, and occasionally ask myself what the fuck happened out there. Granted, there were signs that this might not be the wisest approach. For one thing, sleep didn't come easy, though surely that's to be expected when your best friend and mentor smashes like an egg in front of you. For another, I was behind in the personal hygiene department. I'd given up shaving and laundry, and daily showering seemed excessive now that I was avoiding the gym. I was also drinking every chance I could, and there were chances aplenty during the week off work for what Jeff called recovery time. When beer failed, I helped it along with whiskey. And if that didn't do the job, I rounded the edges with good old BC Bud. I could get away with it temporarily. It's not like Jeff was going to slap me with a urine test the minute I got back. Near the end of my restorative time off, I was partaking of this 3-course meal uh, every afternoon and topping it up through the evening. Toxic table d'hote, my neighbor Melody called it. In those first days, seeing a counselor to talk about my air quote feelings was the last thing I wanted. What did I want? Exactly one thing, to be left alone. So I let the calls go to voicemail, ignored the texts and emails, and basically wrote it out. God knows there were enough people I was supposed to be in touch with, like the crash investigators who showed up the afternoon it happened. Besides taking a stunned statement from me, they called a few times later to confirm some random detail or another, always reminding me that an in-depth interview would follow. There was also Jeff, that's Will's boss, who thank God was playing the hard-ass boss and keeping the media away from Ernie and me, for which he was rewarded with a full-time hounding himself. How could this tragedy have happened? Did a mechanical problem contribute to this tragedy? What does this tragedy mean for your company? For supposed specialists in communication, our intrepid reporters have a limited vocabulary, every question hanging off the same tired word. Then there was Melody, my building's resident hippie chick, who floated onto her next door balcony every time I ventured out on mine. Whether she was curious, lonely, or just lured by the waft of bud, I don't know, but I couldn't sit out there 2 minutes without her materializing and quizzing me through the railings. Don't you ever work? I wanted to ask, but I never did. I didn't want to forge any bonds that I'd have to escape from later. Our passing acquaintance, based on a few words in the lobby every week or two, and the one time I lent her my stepladder to clean cobwebs off her ceiling, it was more than enough. You sure you're okay? She asked for like the 80th time on Tuesday evening, 5 days after the crash. You haven't left your apartment since forever. She leaned out, the balcony rail pressing into her middle. She had on this long skirt, a Stevie Nicks skirt, my buddy Andy would call it, and her hair was like a clump of Spanish moss. She used to go around with it in dreadlocks until someone told her it was cultural appropriation. How would you know where I've been? I know, your front door. You always slam it when you leave. Then you run down the stairs. Boom, boom, boom. I haven't heard that for 3 days. Well, maybe I'm quieter now. You're not. This is why I steer clear of Melody. Besides being a granola girl, so instantly not my type, she's a know-it-all, an expert on the best way to do everything from knocking down spider webs to recycling flyers to locking a bike. You should try crystals, she said. I got this awesome set down in Santa Fe last year. You can borrow them. I'll walk you through it. Why hadn't I brought my book from inside? Even though I'd long ago lost the thread of the story, who'd been killed and who the suspects were, I'd have something to look at to signal how uninterested I was in this kooky girl and her magic rocks. She continued, undaunted. You're hurting, Will. What you've been through, it's so not normal. And what you're doing now, IMHO, it might feel good in the moment, but it's only toxifying. It's just going to make it worse. You know, long term. IMHO, there was nothing humble about my neighbor's unrelenting opinions. How hard would it be to find a new apartment? I wondered idly. I still had a few days off. Then again, it was 2013. What were the chances of scoring another one-bedroom under $1,500 a month, pest-free, with parking, less than an hour's commute to the airport, preferably still in the commercial drive area? Just thinking about it exhausted me. So I settled for re-entering the hovel I already had. Later, I muttered as I shut the sliding door. Melody may have said more, but she was too late. I was in, safe.
Well, there we go. So, Uncontrolled Flight will be on store shelves and online when you hear this. So I say go get one. What do you think?
I think so.
There we go. We're in agreement. So, Frances, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for sitting down to chat about the book.
So, you have a launch coming up on September 12th. Can you tell listeners a little bit about that one?
Yeah, for sure. So this is an online launch, so anybody anywhere can attend free of charge. You just have to get the link on Eventbrite. Just head over to the New S Press website and under events, it's there. And I'm going to be joined by Scott Ludlow, who is a pilot and a former air accident investigator. He's going to be on hand to talk with me and with you, Matt. And so, yeah, we'll look at things like the importance of research in the book and accurate portrayal of aviation world, as well as some other interesting topics.
Yeah, should be a good one. So, with that in mind, check that out on our website. It'll be in the show notes. And thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.